RealAgriculture.com presents Frontlines, geopolitics affecting agriculture with Jacob Shapiro of Bespoke Group and Real Agriculture's Shaun Haney. It's time for another episode of the Frontlines podcast with Shaun Haney of Real Agriculture and, of course, Jacob Shapiro from Bespoke Group. Jacob, how we doing?
Shaun, I've literally been on calls every hour since 8 a.m. this morning. So I cannot be held accountable for anything I say. I'm borderline delirious. I'm going to black out and just tell you what's on top of my mind.
Yeah. So a lot of times in this business, we're like, oh, what a week, but it feels like the velocity and the volume of things in this geopolitical space and how some of, trying to sort out how some of them connect or don't connect. This is quite the time.
It is, although I'm going to take a shot at the media here, and of course you are not included because you're doing the good work. But
Ooh, I appreciate that.
I think there is like a self-reinforcing doom loop here in some sense. Like, look at what's happening in Los Angeles in the United States right now, where it's almost like the media and the Trump administration were made for each other because the media makes a mountain out of a molehill, and then Trump doubles down because he's watching the media and thinks something is going on, and then like the governor doubles down when it's like really not that, like, riots in Los Angeles. Like, this is not that big of a story. Like, why are we blowing this out of proportion? Meanwhile, in London, U.S. and Chinese trade negotiators are basically saying, oh, we've got a U.S.-China trade deal. But no, let's talk about Los Angeles as having some riots. Like, it's just, I think there is a velocity to events that are happening. I also think the world is changing, and I think human beings are uncomfortable with change. And then I also think the media is competing with people like you or with social media. And to get more clicks, to make their business models work, it has to be, well, what's falling apart? What's the next war? What's the next thing that's on fire? Because that's what's going to drive their business model. So there's some extent to which it's true.
The Los Angeles mayor on that point was pretty critical. She used the phrasing, the imagery used. She didn't say, she didn't say media, but the imagery being used and how didn't really provide a context for how small of an area, like 1 square mile that we're actually talking about here, amongst a city that's over, I think, 550 square miles. So pretty small.
Well, and I first learned, I was on social media. I first learned that something was going on in Los Angeles because people were circulating purported images of what was going on. It turned out to, like, the images that I first saw were images from 5 years ago or 6 years ago when there was another riot and people were lighting cars on fire, which speaks to, oh, you had stock imagery from a couple of years ago on this. And also, that's not even what's happening. Like, what are we actually talking about here, people? So, yeah, I'm not telling listeners to say that, like, nothing is going on, but I also, like, think that sometimes we're over-indexing on the wrong things. And we're indulging too much on this. Like, we need the next dopamine hit. It's like we need the next hit of what's breaking and what's falling apart. And it's hard to get out of that rat race with the way that social media and some of these other things are beaming the negative news into our brains.
Yeah, you're right. The connection between the media and the Trump administration, they are kind of a gift to each other.
It is a symbiotic relationship. They were made for each other. He gives them clicks. The media gives him things to be self-righteous and angry about and to prove himself a tough. I mean, if we'd been talking a week ago, we would have been talking about the Trump-Musk breakup and how he's capitulating on tariffs left and right and how, inflation looks like it's going up and Treasury yields going up and the dollar still declining. And no, now instead the media narrative in the United States is he's doing his strongman law and order thing, which the liberals are weeping over. But the people who support law and order, which is a lot of the conservative constituency, is like, great, this is the Trump that we were voting for. And even Musk and Trump are making up because they're on the same side of the Los Angeles issue. So yeah, I think it's all interconnected in that sense. And I think it's harder and harder. And this may be why people feel why we feel this velocity, because I think it's harder and harder to get to what is really going on. And that's before you get to artificial intelligence and the deep fakes and all the things that are making us doubt the things that we're seeing in real time. Yeah,
you mentioned those London meetings, the U.S.-China trade teams, talk and trade, trying to come to some sort of a deal. What we've been talking about on Real Agriculture is not a comprehensive trade agreement like we would think about the CPTPP or even USMCA. We're talking about essentially like an MOU, an arrangement around some key parameters that are important to the White House, or what do you view in these talks?
I think that the Trump administration has realized for now that they are not holding the cards that they thought they were. And I think you can see that in, the way that the economic data has come out, treasury yields, market response, the dollar index, all these different things. I also think, Scott Bessent had his own sort of mission, which was not the same as Peter Navarro, which was not the same as Howard Lutnick. And Bessent seems to be the one who has Trump's ear right now. So I think this can all change very quickly. It's even less than an MOU. MOUs are usually not worth the paper that they're printed on. We don't even have an MOU. We have a quote unquote handshake. So we're doing like, I don't know, mafia level deal arrangements here with these things. But I think part of what's happening is that the Trump administration realizes there are limits to what they can do, and they've hit the constraints, and now they need to produce deals. They need to show that Trump, the deal maker, is in town. So I expect a flurry of deals, and probably this China one will be the first one. But I think that something fundamental has changed here in the last 6 months, which is both American allies and rivals no longer have confidence in the United States. They no longer trust the United States. So I think the Trump administration will want to have made for TV deals and show all the ways that their use of tariffs and protectionism has brought countries like China to the table. And China, which has economic problems of its own, will say, okay, sure, we'll buy stuff from you that we can't get from anywhere else, but underneath the surface, they'll do what they did the first time around with the phase one deal, which is they probably won't follow through on their commitments. All of the areas where they're importing things from the United States, they will start revving up domestic capacity or alternative sources. And 2-3 years from now, as the United States has become more dependent on China and China has become less dependent on the United States, it will not be a good deal for the United States in the long run. The metaphor I've used in talking about this is radiation sickness. If you are exposed to a high dose of radiation, you're initially very sick, and then it appears like you're getting better. But the cellular framework of your body is something is wrong. And over time, you're going to continue to decline rapidly. I think that's a metaphor for what's happening with the United States right now. You had the initial shock. Now I think it looks like, oh, maybe there's some semblance of normalcy, but when you think about what the U.S. is doing long term and what that means for trust in the United States long term and in the liberal international order that the United States built, I think something has fundamentally changed there, and that we're not going back to the world before it.
You mentioned Besant. It's my perception has been that he not only has Trump's ear, but he seems to be the most stable, not saying crazy stuff, admitting, when asked about the trade talks with China, he even said it's a start, which I thought was an interesting sort of tell. He wasn't, hyperbolically talking about it as some sort of comprehensive thing. I guess it's maybe no surprise that Bloomberg had a story this week that he's rumored to maybe be the replacement for Powell at the Fed I guess a year from now.
Yeah, the White House refuted that pretty quickly. I was actually a little bit nervous about that report because does that mean that Trump is souring on him and that he wants to have him exit stage left so that he's only in charge of interest rates and so that Trump will have a lackey at the head of the Federal Reserve and then he can start doing the Navarro sort of song and dance when it comes to trade? It's also, Bessent looks like the adult in the room only because the other people that are in the room, we're talking about people like Howard Lutnick. And Shaun, you know that I'm fastidiously apolitical and I don't like to get ideological, but I cannot help it with this Lutnick guy. He is such a moron. Everything is so self-evidently stupid that he says out of his mouth that I can't believe. And he's more successful than I am in my career, so I shouldn't be throwing stones, I guess. I don't know if you saw that report from Nikkei that said while the U.S. was negotiating with Japan, they had Jameson Greer, who is the U.S. trade rep, and Bessent and Lutnick in the room at the same time, and they had to pause the meeting because the three of them had to go talk about what they actually wanted from Japan.
I saw that.
By the way, while the U.S. and China have their trade deal or their handshake agreement, we just had the fifth round of Japanese-U.S. trade talks, and the Japanese negotiator came out and told the media, I'm almost quoting verbatim here, we agree on absolutely nothing after 5 rounds. You can have a deal with China, but not with your closest security and arguably economic partner in the Asia Pacific. Maybe there's a logic to doing a deal with China first. I don't know, but the allies like Canada are still sort of being left out to dry there. So anyway, I don't know that there's any any credence to the Besant move. But I think you're right that he's the adult in the room and that he's the one that has Trump's ear now. But that should not make anyone who's listening to this comfortable, because we saw this with the first Trump administration and it's gone exactly the same in the second Trump administration. It's a revolving door. People come in, people come out for a while. You fly close to the sun and Trump likes you, and then it's Icarus and your wings melt and suddenly you're Elon Musk and you're thinking maybe I should go to Mars. Maybe things are going to be better there for me. So I don't know how long Besant can keep this position. And I'd also just say, Besant has had this plan since the very beginning. And if things had rolled out the way that Besant wanted, it probably would have made a lot more sense. The imposition of the Liberation Day tariffs and all these things that Besant is now cleaning up, that's not what he wanted. He was the one saying that's not going to happen. It's just the threat of tariffs that are going to lead to a renegotiation of U.S. trade relationships with everybody else. And I think he's making a really short-sighted mistake in which he thinks that he can put the genie back in the bottle. And as I said to you just earlier, the genie's not going back in the bottle. Like, fundamental, irrevocable damage is pejorative. So let's just say things have changed. You're not going to go back to the way things were in January 2025. This is a different world, a world in which U.S. Treasury bonds are not a risk-free asset, in which people prefer gold and Bitcoin over the U.S. dollar, and where even U.S. allies like Japan are basically saying, screw you, we're not doing what you're asking until you go back to the way that things were before on tariffs.
Yeah, I don't know what's in the water at the Commerce Department, but first Peter Navarro in the first administration, now Lutnick. There's something going on.
And Navarro is still around, I mean.
Oh, he is. Yeah, he makes the rounds on much of the financial channels, and much of late, actually. He's kind of resurfaced as one of those people close to the sun again. I want to ask you about Iran and Israel. This is, as a watcher of these things and trying to understand it, it seems like an incredibly volatile situation that is escalating to very scary places quickly. How do you evaluate?
Yeah. Let's try and take our own advice here and take a step back, because there is something important happening here. I don't want to discount it, but I want to try and give us some context rather than going straight to, oh my God, World War III, the Middle East, it's on, it's imminent, it's happening soon. Yeah. I think when you zoom out from U.S. foreign policy, there are a couple of anachronistic problems around the world that are really relics of the Cold War and which never got resolved in the Cold War and are just still there. They don't make any sense in present day politics. They were really Cold War issues, and yet they have remained, and there's now no impetus to move them. The three big ones are North Korea, Cuba, and Iran. The U.S. overturned or helped overturn a democratic election in Iran in the early 1950s, Mohammad Mossadegh. They helped the Shah sort of ascend to power, keep him propped up until the Iranian Revolution. The United States played both sides of the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, and now the Soviet Union collapses. And honestly, at that point, the United States stops caring about this that much. It only has this reflexive mistrust of what is a theocratic and thuggish regime that is governing Tehran right now. So there's this inherent mistrust. But if you were thinking just purely apolitically, if you were just starting from scratch in the year of our Lord 2025 for U.S.-Iran relations, it makes no sense that the United States and Iran are at each other's throats. Iran is a perfect counterbalance to some of the things that are happening in the parts of the world where the United States wants a balance of power, so it doesn't have to intervene all the time. Turkey is rising in the Middle East. Great. Have Iran be a counterpoint. Russia receding from the South Caucasus, receding from Central Asia. Iran could be a great player there to sort of play that game. And Iran and Russia have mutual distrust going back centuries. The future of Afghanistan and the subcontinent, well, Iran might have something to say there too. But the two sides distrust each other. Iran thinks it needs a nuclear deterrent. The United States has talked about regime change in Iran for literally decades. You go back and forth. Now, all that said, my framework has been that it makes sense for the United States and Iran to have a deal. It makes sense for them to make a nuclear deal. It makes sense for the United States to say, we don't want to be messing around in the Persian Gulf right now. We'd love to avoid, or at least lengthen the period until Iran gets a nuclear weapon as far as possible. And for Iran, it would be nice to be able to sell oil again on markets without getting sanctioned every other time they try to turn around and do something. Nice to start building their position, because they've taken a lot of losses recently. The loss of Assad in Syria, the loss of Hezbollah by the Israeli attack, everything else. And I still think the geopolitical framework tells me there's going to be a U.S.-Iran deal. Now, you know who doesn't want a U.S.-Iran deal? Israel. Israel hates this. And Israel is as short-sighted as anyone about this. If I had Benjamin Netanyahu or an Israeli security figure in front of me, I would tell them to their face, you are worried about the wrong existential threat. Your future will be decided by Turkey, not by Iran. And you might want to start preparing for that. But whatever, they're not listening to me. They're focused on Iran. And when Assad fell back in December, you might remember, Israel started bombing Syria. And it turns out part of what they were bombing was Syrian air defenses, so that now there really is no Syrian air defense system that can stand up to Israeli attack. That's so important, not because Israel's going to bomb Syria, but because now if Israel wants to undertake long-range attacks against Iran, suddenly Syria is pretty easy to fly over. And so that makes the calculations a lot easier in general. So I think Israel is beating the drum here. It's banging the drum. I think Iran has been dragging its feet because it wants to extract a maximum number of concessions from the Trump administration before it agrees to anything. And I think President Trump is getting impatient. I think he wanted a deal weeks ago now, months ago. He thought this was already going to be a done deal so he could move on to Xi Jinping and whatever else he wants to focus on. And it's just not coming. So now he's getting a little bit frustrated. So you put all of that together and you get, somebody asking Trump, I think it was yesterday, and he's like, yeah, it could be imminent. Like maybe the Israelis are going to strike. And you've got people talking to CBS News saying that the Israelis are going to strike Iran imminently. And the last thing I'll say on this is just there are limits to what this conflict can look like because Israel and Iran are far away from each other. There's not a whole heck of a lot they can do to each other. We saw this last year when they traded some blows military to military, where some rockets were launched and then some rockets were launched this way. I don't think Israel by itself can knock out Iranian nuclear capacity, but I also didn't know that Israel was going to completely destroy Hezbollah leadership with an inventive use of pagers. So maybe they have some trick up their sleeve that I'm not sure about, and maybe the Iranians are afraid of that too. The Iranians have sort of leaked out there that if that happens, their response will be on U.S. military installations in Iraq and in other parts of the Middle East. And then you sort of bring the United States to the conflict and maybe Trump has to do something. So I started sort of at the top with the context and to say, yes, there are some signals that this has turned really, really quickly, but I think it's in the U.S. interest to have a deal, and I think it's in Iran's interest to have a deal. And if this pushes forward into conflict, it's going to be, I think, because Israel successfully stirred the pot. And if you're asking me as a betting man, like 70-30, there's a deal. So that's still 30% that we're talking war and, conflagration and all these other sorts of things, but 70% that we get a deal. The last thing we have to say before we leave this is that the Houthis are still alive in Yemen. And they are still preventing shipping from returning to the Persian Gulf, despite President Trump trying to bomb them. I think you and I talked about how confusing it was that Biden didn't try to annihilate them. Well, Trump tried and he failed. And I think there is also something to be said here about the future of warfare, because if the much vaunted United States Navy and Air Force cannot knock out the Houthis, and if Ukraine can knock out strategic bombers inside of Russia, well, maybe Israel can knock out Iranian nukes. And maybe all these things can happen without World War III emerging just because the technology has changed. So I threw a lot at you there, but I think it's an interesting window into how to think about this versus how the media will play it, which is, oh my God, World War III, the Middle East, this is the year. This is the time it's really going to happen.
Well, my next question is a little bit in the weeds, but that's where we live here on the Frontlines podcast, is Steve Witkoff, generational talent and success story when it comes to the real estate market in New York and beyond. He is special envoy to the Middle East for the United States. There's rumors are floating. Now, all of a sudden, there's like sort of the trial balloons are out there. There's criticism of the job that he is doing, that he's way over his head. Does it seem to be that way?
To be fair to him, pretty much everybody would be over their head in the position of special envoy to the Middle East. Both parties, going back decades, have tried to fix this and have only made it worse. The United States is no longer geopolitically dependent on the Middle East. Hasn't been since the shale revolution in 2008. The entire reason that the United States was interested in the Middle East was oil. That's it. And the United States does not need Middle Eastern oil anymore. So as we were sort of talking about with Iran, it's an anachronistic policy. The United States is used to caring about the Middle East. It has an entire foreign policy establishment that is designed to care about it. It's got think tanks that have been obsessing over it for decades. And yet, the United States doesn't really need it anymore. And you've had multiple presidents. It started with Obama and trying to pivot to the Asia Pacific. Trump 1, Biden, even Trump 2. so many U.S. administrations saying, we're going to get out of the Middle East. We're going to get out of the Middle East. We're going to get out of the Middle East. And here we are, June 12th, 2025. Okay, we've got a special envoy, and we're talking about, are we bombing Iran? What are we doing? Trump's first visit is to Saudi Arabia. Like something here is not quite adding up. So of course he's over his head. Everybody would be over their head. These are conflicts that go back centuries. They will continue whether the United States is there or not. And I wish that someone could get through to U.S. policymakers. This is just like, this is not our job anymore. And to the extent that it was ever our job, we were never going to be able to fix things here. It was more about managing a dumpster fire rather than thinking we were going to create, liberal democratic oases or Trump towers in the Gaza Strip.
There was a lot written at the end of the Biden administration about Biden's frustration with Israel. Is where does the U.S. sit on that right now? Is President Trump just as frustrated?
I don't know that he's just as frustrated. I don't have any personal contact with him. He has certainly been less friendly to Israel than he was during the first administration. But I also think let's remember the U.S. president in sort of my lifetime who was toughest on Israel was George H.W. Bush. So there are standards here, and I think we forget history a little bit. Part of the reason that the Oslo peace accords happened is because George H.W. Bush was so tough on Israel. And Biden, I think, ultimately was not that tough on Israel. And Trump has certainly not been that tough on Israel, too. Now, Trump is talking about trying to make this Iran deal, and Israel doesn't like that. So now you're getting some of that pushback. But it's not like Trump has come in and said, stop destroying the Gaza Strip, or recognize a Palestinian state tomorrow, or move the embassy back from Jerusalem because that's posing an impediment to the things that I want to do in the rest of the region. So I do think that Trump has goals that ultimately he doesn't care what Israel says or does or not. Like, he's going to pursue his goals. And during Trump 1, those goals were much more in line with what Israel wanted. And we're getting a test in Trump 2 about whether those are going to go along, or whether Israel is now going to be taken for a ride for putting too many of their eggs in the Trump basket. But no, I don't think we're seeing anything like, even with Biden, like we're seeing nothing like when George H.W. Bush basically told the Israelis to stop doing what they were doing, or else they were going to risk future U.S. support. Like, no president since George H.W. Bush has even come close to doing that. The closest is Obama, and even he, I think, a lot of it was for show.
You mentioned earlier about what some sort of conflict between Israel and Iran could look like. Maybe we look over what's been happening recently with Ukraine and Russia, and that pretty, I guess, surprise attack using drones that Ukraine used on Russia, somewhere between 14 to 18 months in planning. What's the tell there? What's the signal?
It was a shocking event. I'm often constantly, when I'm looking at developments every single day, I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of a historian 20 years from now and say, is this going to matter? Like, is somebody going to remember this 20 years from now as important? Or is just this, the newspaper had to have a headline today, and so this was the headline today. And I had been saying for most of this year that I thought the thing that historians would look to was the break in U.S.-Europe relations. I thought that was really the transformative thing that happened that maybe was going to reshape international affairs. I think that this Ukrainian drone attack on Russia's Air Force might have taken that championship belt for 2025, and I'll tell you why. Long-range strategic attacks against a country's Air Force, that's supposed to be the domain of very, very powerful state actors. And what Ukraine did, it was a brilliant technological operation and an intelligence operation. They basically got a couple hundred drones, maybe a little more than 100. The drones costing roughly $600 a pop. Got them into Russia, so in containers, got their operators inside Russia. So these are drones that they're not governed by radio signals or things like that. It's like very special fiber optics. So the operator has to be within a few miles of the drone in order for it to work, and attacked Russian air bases. And was it 4 or 5? Was it 13 bombers or 40 bombers? Like, the data is really scant, but they did. They knocked out Russian strategic bombers, the very bombers that have been bombing Kyiv and other Ukrainian cities. And it just goes to show you that the nature of war has completely changed. If we'd been talking 3 weeks ago and you had brought up Russia and Ukraine, I would have said, well, Russia's grinding Ukraine into dust and they have more resources and they're going to outsuffer them. And eventually Ukraine might have to sue for peace, or think about the fact that they're running out of manpower, or all these other things. But now Ukraine has basically shown us, well, no. We can strike at the heart of Russian military power for the cost of, 100 drones times $600 plus some operators. Like that's a really big deal. And when you also think about what this is going to mean for even like the Russian economy. So they basically smuggled these drones into Russia in a container. So now Russian security forces are going to have to inspect every single container that comes into the country to make sure that they're not laced with drones or other things. If you're the United States and you're trying to take lessons from this, are you going to inspect every single Chinese container that reaches a U.S. port or is destined for some place inside the United States? Because if there's a war there, then some Chinese operators will start operating drones that are bombing critical infrastructure or U.S. military installations or things like that. Or think if you get into a battle in the South China Sea over Taiwan. You know that I don't think that's going to happen, but let's take the bait for a second and say, okay, China invades Taiwan. Let's say the United States wants to defend Taiwan. The United States has the most advanced navy the world has ever seen, 250 of the most incredible ships that have ever sailed the oceans. 9 aircraft carriers. Nobody even comes close to that. What's stopping the Chinese from getting a couple thousand drones, which they could make in a couple of days, and just kamikazing the carriers and eliminating them completely? U.S. shipbuilding capacity is completely anemic now. So if you lose the ships, it's not like you're going to be able to do anything about it. So now, overnight, if as you're trying to defend Taiwan, your big aircraft carriers are gone, and all because the Chinese know how to use drones and they can use this new technology in this way. So I really do think, sort of like with Israel's use of the pagers and what that meant for global supply chains, the use of drones in this particular way should make us all stop and say, well, what do we really know about military power? And what does this mean about power projection? Is the United States really the most militarily powerful country in the world? Do its carriers have anti-drone technology? Could it resist an attack like that if it came from China or from some other actor? It can't even stop the Houthis in the Persian Gulf. So I think when we're thinking about the future of war and the future balance of power in the world from a military perspective, like these things change. They're not static. And what was true a year ago is not necessarily true today based on the technology that comes forward. And hey, I bet you there's going to be like 50 defense tech startups about how to resist drone attacks here that will be founded in the next 6 to 12 months. And maybe they'll figure it out. And then maybe we'll be on to the next thing. But these things change over time. They're extremely dynamic. And that Ukrainian attack on Russia showed us just what a different world we're living in from a security and military perspective.
And overlay the fact that the technologically the leader in drones is China, like by far.
China's the leader in most things that have to be made. I mean, the U.S. is still great when it comes to research and maybe the cutting edge of some things, but even the things that the United States is at the most cutting edge of, like those things are often manufactured in China or manufactured with components or inputs that have to come from China. And if you put China and the non-Western rest of the world's manufacturing capacity and compare it to the West, it's more than 50%, much more than 50%. This is, I think, one of the real problems with Trump's trade policy and foreign policy. It's that it's not going to work. He's copying the playbook from William McKinley in the early 1900s when the U.S. was the one that was manufacturing things, when it was the U.S. that was doing to Britain and Germany and some of these other established powers what China has already done to the U.S. and to the West. So it's not going to work. Honestly, that strategy would probably work better for China than it would work for the United States. It's sort of an incredible policy error.
Any outcomes from the G7 next week that you're looking for or signals?
No, I hate meetings like the G7 and the UN General Assembly because the journalists basically stop working. They just put out press releases about stuff.
Who wouldn't want to be in Kananaskis at this time of the year, Jacob? It's gorgeous.
Well, yeah, sure. I hope I get an invite. My shade thrown aside.
So just nothing from it?
No, I don't think so. I mean, show me the number of G7 meetings that have had any impact on anything. I don't think that is something the historians will be writing about. I'm sure they'll have very nice food and they'll produce some very strongly worded communiques, and then we will all go back to doing what we were doing before they had their meeting.
What do you think about Carney inviting Modi?
The United States, I mean, talking about own goals, I mean, the United States and India, things were going well, and Trump and Modi have a really good relationship. And then you get that, mini Pakistan, India, I don't want to call it a war. Can we call it, it's like a little more than a skirmish, a little less than a war. And India does its thing. And what does the United States do? It says, not just the United States, President Trump says, I got these guys to have a ceasefire because I used the threat of tariffs against both sides to come to the table. Shouldn't they both get along? And maybe that sounds fine to our listeners, but to India just read or just heard you're establishing a moral equivalency between Pakistani terrorists and Indian self-defense of what we consider Indian territory. What gives? And the Trump administration has not let up on this. They're even inviting Pakistani officials to parades and other things like that. And India is still like, what is going on here? So I think the U.S. India relationship, I was never particularly sanguine that it was going to be a super close one, but it has taken a big quiet hit in the last 4 to 6 weeks. And so, in that sense, Mr. Carney, I think, has his finger on the pulse. Because if you are a country like Canada that is thinking long term about how to very painfully sort of realign Canadian interests away from your southern neighbor, because your southern neighbor has become a little bit more volatile. India is a great country with which to develop relations. That's 1 billion+ people. They're going to want a lot of the things that Canada sells commodity wise. They're going to want a lot of the expertise that Canada has developed from a manufacturing perspective, even from an IP perspective. Everybody wants to be tight with India. And because of what the United States has done, maybe there's an opening for Canada here to get in front of the line. I think it's a smart move by him. And I think it's enabled in part by a real unforced error in how the United States has treated India in the context of that recent conflagration.
One of the things we're hearing lots about is this, again, deal between Canada and the U.S. They've been meeting behind the scenes. There's a 5-page document going back and forth, according to CBC. A component of that is something that Carney has been publicly in favor of, is this idea, this golden dome that is Trump's been pushing. What exactly is this golden dome, and is this Carney just sort of following along? Is this actually an idea that has some staying power, or what's at work here?
It's the eternal return of the same. Ronald Reagan what was it, Star Wars, what he called missile defense?
Something
So
like that.
Golden Dome, think of it as Israel's Iron Dome. It's just updated in gold because President Trump loves gold. And the idea is that you're going to build missile defense, inside of the United States, maybe extend it to Canada. And I'm sure that if you want to curry favor with President Trump, like buying, military equipment from the United States is something that this administration has like asked other countries and allies to do. So that's a good way to ingratiate yourself and maybe increase your security around the margins. But this goes back to our conversation about the future of war. Think about that Israel-Iran conflict that we already mentioned from last year. Iran fired a bunch of rockets at Israel, and almost none of them landed because of how successful Iron Dome was at intercepting them. But here's the problem. Iron Dome anti-missile interceptors cost tens of millions of dollars per interceptor, maybe in the single digit millions if we're being generous. Some of the rockets that Iran was firing at Israel were in the tens of thousands. So even if you create a gold dome, are you really going to have enough interceptors to protect from your rivals trying to overwhelm your system? And is that going to protect you from drones, or is that going to protect you from some of the other changes in technology that we're talking about? It honestly feels like a defense solution for the 1970s that sounds nice and gets some really nice contracts for Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and some of the others, and gets Trump, getting the military industrial complex humming, but fundamentally doesn't do a whole lot to improve the U.S. security situation. So it makes total sense for Carney to sign on to it. It's a relatively low stakes thing for Canada to curry some favor, to at least try and repair some of the good feelings between the two sides. But I actually think the U.S. focus on something like Gold Dome underscores exactly what I'm talking about, that our assumptions about what defense and security look like, we're thinking about a Cold War world, and we're not in a Cold War world anymore. Like, we're in a very different world, and the nature of the threats is very different. And Gold Dome is only going to protect you if the Russians go crazy and fire some missiles at you. It's not going to protect you if somebody figures out how to get 1,000 drones in your country and is attacking critical infrastructure.
Yeah. Russia's not that crazy.
No, I don't think any country is that crazy. I think if you're looking for silver linings here, there's a reason why no country since the United States has used nuclear weapons since 1945. Because even the craziest, like Kim Jong-un and North Korea, that's probably the craziest country that there is out there. They're not firing nuclear weapons. Mutually assured destruction has held. So no, I don't think anybody's that crazy. The type of actor that you would have to be worried about is, some kind of rogue state that doesn't have an interest in anything besides creating chaos. Could they steal a weapon like that and make a dirty bomb or try and get something through? Again, though, Gold Dome's not going to stop you, or it's not going to stop that sort of thing. So is it a nice insurance policy? Does it, create some nice growth? Does it create some nice contracts for different companies that are manufacturing these things? Sure. But am I going to sleep any better or worse at night because I have Gold Dome in my country? Sorry, no. Like it's not really going to move the needle for me there all that much.
Yeah. Okay. To wrap up, we got a month till we talk again. What are we watching out for? What threads are we following really closely?
Um, well, there's a couple things. First of all, we need to continue to watch U.S. economic data. So every morning I'm checking treasury yields. I'm checking the value of the dollar. I'm looking at oil prices. I'm looking at gold. I'm even looking at the price of Bitcoin because I'm using all that as a proxy for, is there some level of faith being restored in the United States, or are we continuing to go down? And is this multipolar world fracturing and accelerating? So that's one. We obviously have to keep our eye on this recent acceleration of events with Iran and the United States. But I think the bigger thing is there legs to this U.S.-China trade deal? Because if there is, and if it goes from handshake to no actual agreement, then I think that opens up the space for the parade of deal making to begin. And whether that's with Canada and Mexico over USMCA, whether that's with Japan, whether that's with the EU, it seems to me that the Trump administration is saying that, okay, let's do China first, and then we can start doing all these other things, and we can start, taking out the mission accomplished banner. Again, for long term, I don't think it does that much for the United States, but those are some of the things that I'll be focusing on. And I'm sure, Shaun, that a month from now, something will have happened that neither one of us anticipated, and that we will have to spend our time learning about because, that's the way that things are right now.
Yeah, great stuff. Hey, Jacob, if somebody wants to get a hold of you for your services over there at Bespoke Group and maybe have you speak at an event, how do they do that?
Very simple. I have so many email addresses now, it's confusing. So just email me at jacob@jacobshapiro.com. You can find my podcast. You can find me on social media. I'm not hard to find, or just email Shaun, and I'm sure you can find your way to me. But there's my email address, and I'm not that hard to locate. You'll know I'm really, really doing well in my career, Shaun, when I moved to a deserted island with no cell phones, and it's hard to get a hold of me. But I'm not quite there yet.
Great stuff. That's another episode of the Frontlines podcast with Jacob Shapiro of Bespoke Group. Thanks a lot, everybody. And you can send your feedback and commentary to Haney at realagriculture.com.